What is popular with developers right now, and what's going to be popular in 2024? In this video, we're going to be looking through a 2023 developer survey from Stack Overflow to get a better understanding of the current trends in our industry. We'll also talk through how it impacts specifically C# developers. Now, before we dive right in, I want to share a couple of things with you. First, if you're interested in improving your C# skills, make sure you subscribe to this channel. With over 500 videos on C# and counting, it's a perfect place to learn and grow your skill. Second, if you're looking for more free C# resources, go to iamtimcorey.com and go to the resources tab. There you'll find my podcast, my C# projects page, and much more. Third, if you're ready to dive deep into a C# topic, I have a variety of courses that can help. Not only will you receive a world-class education, but you'll also help fund my free content so that everyone can have a great education in C#, not just those who can afford it. So let's dive right into the developer survey from Stack Overflow. Now, I do want to point out at the very beginning here that this is not necessarily a scientific survey. They did not take a true cross-section. They just asked people, hey, would you like to take a survey? So there's going to be some bias in this. So just be careful of that you don't start taking too many conclusions or go too far with your conclusions. This is more of a, hey, here's what seems to be going on. Here's what people are talking about from the people we talked to. Now, there's over 90,000 of them that responded, so it's a big group, but you still have to know about Stack Overflow and the developer survey. Now, one of the questions in here, we're not going to cover that specifically, but one of the covers talks about if you use Stack Overflow. Well, this is the Stack Overflow survey, so yeah, the vast majority of them did. Not really a big shocker there. That doesn't mean that every developer uses Stack Overflow, although it seems like that's a pretty good bet. So let's dive right into, we're going to go down to the technology. The other thing to note here is this is worldwide. So if you go to our developer profile, you can look at key territories. For example, 21% of respondents are from the United States. That's of 52,000 respondents. Not everybody responded to every question. So what this means is that with only 21% from the United States, that means that when you're looking at things, for example, a salary, well, that salary, if it's worldwide average, that's going to be a much different thing than if you're looking specifically in Germany or in the United States. So just keep those things in mind. The same with demographics. This demographic, it's a pretty decent view on development, although I will tell you there are a lot more people in these categories than are responding to the survey. So just because these older categories don't have as many people responding doesn't mean there's not more people in those categories. So again, just to be clear and set some expectations on these numbers. So let's go look at the technology, and we're going to start with most popular technologies. I am going to limit these a little bit. So all respondents, that's not really necessarily that useful. And here's why. Because it includes people learning to code. I am not saying that they're not valuable people. They are valuable. However, when it comes to what you are learning versus what you actually are going to use in the workplace, that's going to be a little bit different. So I want to move into the professional developers, the people who are actually building stuff, being paid to do stuff in code, because that's going to change our numbers a little bit. Also note that this is not out of 100%, meaning you cannot add two things together and get less than or up to 100%. So you can do more than one thing. For example, JavaScript developers, well, they're almost certainly going to work with HTML and CSS. In fact, I'm surprised at this gap here because yes, you can work with Node, but really you almost certainly are dealing with some HTML at some point. So, but with that, JavaScript hits the number one at 65% of all developers that respond to this survey. Again, 67,000 of them that responded to this question. 65% use JavaScript. 52% use HTML and CSS. The number 3 is SQL. But what SQL or what SQL? Well, that we're going to find out later that it doesn't necessarily mean Microsoft SQL. It might actually mean Postgres or SQLite or MySQL. So that's just the overall language, the T-SQL language that they're talking about. Note that TypeScript is pretty high up on this list as well, as is Python, as is Bash and Shell. So that's because, these are the things that we use even if we're not doing that for our day-to-day job. Meaning I might be a C# developer, but I also will probably do some JavaScript, HTML, SQL, maybe in some Python or TypeScript, and we'll definitely be using a Bash or a Shell. So just note that just because one is listed doesn't mean that that's their primary job. It just means that that's one of the tools they use at work. Now, a thing to note is that Java is here at 30.49%, and C# is right behind with 29.16%. There was a time when there was a vast separation here, and that's no longer really the case. Behind that, C++, PHP, C, Go, PowerShell. One of the things that I do want to point out here is this is where popularity doesn't necessarily equal I do it in my job. So there's things that people like to do, and then there's things that people get paid to do, and they don't always overlap. So that's something to think through. The other thing to think through is the fact that when something's newer, you're going to have less people in it. That does not mean it's not a growing in popularity thing. For example, Rust is growing in popularity, but it's down here at 12%. So just note that's, that's not real huge, but it is growing. I mean, it's still a lot of people. But then down here, Swift, well, that's mobile development on iOS or on Apple. And yet it's only at less than 5% or just around 5%. So even though you may think, oh, well, mobile development's super popular or whatever, that doesn't necessarily mean that a lot of people do that for a job. And in fact, Swift is just above 1 percentage point above VisualBasic.net. So VB is still hanging in there at 4% of people, with Delphi not far behind with 3.23%. Just so you know, everyone hates MATLAB. That seems to be the conclusion from every one of these surveys is some people have to use it, but they hate it. So I have not used MATLAB in I don't know how long, but yeah, that seems to be the pretty clear indicator there. So again, just kind of take this stuff and don't look at this and go, oh my goodness, that means I have to know JavaScript in order to get a job because 65% of people do. That's actually not the way to look at these charts. You want to be careful about the very top because the fact that you should probably know these things or know how to use them, but they're also saturated markets, meaning there's a ton of people that are doing those things already, and so you're one of a million. On the other hand, you can come down here where, Zig is going to be one we're going to see later on the chart. Only 0.7% of people actually use Zig. And so you might think, oh, I should never get into that. But, you could because there's not much competition there, but it's also probably not many jobs. So there's kind of a middle ground here where you might want to think about, I know C# sits right in the middle. Huh. Ironic that, huh? But no, I'm saying that, just think through. Don't just chase this chart and say, okay, I must know these things because they're the top of the chart. Just don't read it that way. Okay? Now let's go down and scroll down and look at databases. So Postgres takes the top, then MySQL, professional developers. Postgres, MySQL, SQLite. So we've got the ability to be free. The first two, we've got the ability to work offline and on mobile. As a third one, then we have Microsoft SQL Server, which is an enterprise, as the next one, and then MongoDB. Interesting that Redis is here and is so low. I was surprised by that because of the fact that Redis really supports all of these. So now, yes, it doesn't necessarily work offline, but everything else, it allows you to do some really great caching stuff. I was surprised it was as low as it was. So that's just something to think through. Oracle down here at 10%. This is one of the databases I dislike using, but there's a lot of people out there that are still using it. So it's a pretty big enterprise thing. So again, just the way to read this is, I should probably learn more about this. And you know what? I have not yet covered Postgres on my channel. And it's something I should probably do. That's one of the things that I see from this. From your perspective, you know what? It's probably a good thing to know because these are options. And it's probably good to know. For example, we've covered SQLite, or SQLite, MySQL, Microsoft SQL, MongoDB, Redis, and I've used all of these in production in various jobs and even with imtimcorey.com stuff where, I use MongoDB quite a bit. I also use SQL Server quite a bit. I use Redis quite a bit, SQLite for offline stuff. So, having options is really good. Okay, so let's say the cloud platforms, professional developers, over half of them use AWS, which is not surprising. I mean, AWS has always been the market leader in cloud. What is a bit frustrating is the way they do it because it makes it kind of messy. But they're a cheap option and they're everywhere. Microsoft Azure is number 2 with 27.8%, which is what's surprising though is that Google Cloud is right behind them at 23.95%. Now, some of this may be that, people want to do multi-cloud strategy. I'm not a big fan of multi-cloud, but I understand that you're trying to do something with redundancy there that really doesn't work that way. But, I understand if your organization wants to do that. But trusting Google after all the things they've killed makes me super nervous, especially in enterprise type environment. But it's indeed pretty popular. Cloudflare is only at 14.99%. That should probably be higher, I think, because Cloudflare, well, first of all, it runs half the internet with DNS, but it also has some really great features for caching and other things that make it a pretty great partner for a lot of your web applications. So that's pretty low actually for me, but yeah. So there's Cloudflare. There's other options here. Again, you can learn about some things. Some things, maybe high on the list, but maybe you shouldn't get into. But others are growing things that you can look into and maybe add another tool to your toolbox of options. So that's cloud. Let's talk about web frameworks and technologies. Again, professional developers. And the first one, probably not a surprise to anybody, React with Node coming in right behind. These are pretty much neck and neck. They're pretty much the same percentage point. What's interesting though is number 3 is jQuery. This is one of those things where, again, just because people use it doesn't mean it's their primary job. And just because something's new and popular does not mean that everybody's doing that. So yes, React is pretty popular, but jQuery really shouldn't be used hardly at all anymore, except for the fact that, for little projects, it works well. And it's a lot of people that also don't know not to use it because you can do all the things or almost all the things natively that you used to have to do using the shims that jQuery provided. So there's kind of a mixed bag there. I'm not real thrilled that it's that high, but at the same time, if it's for small projects, I totally understand. If it's because you don't know any better, that's something you need to fix. So jQuery should be lower in this list. Angular is next, and Express. ASP.NET Core comes in at 18.8%. So that's next in the list. And then if you notice down 3 more is ASP.NET. That's the .NET Framework version at 14.16%. Now here again is where you can't make the mistake of adding these two together, because you could say, well, as far as C# development goes, we've got 18.8% and another 14.16%. That, equals 33%. Therefore, it's actually number 3 in the list. That's not how that works. So the reason why is because if you're a .NET Framework developer, well, you may just be doing just .NET Framework, but you may also be trying, and you should be, trying to upgrade to .NET Core, which means that you'd probably check that box as well. So how many people are checking both of these boxes? Probably quite a few, not all of them, but I would expect to be in the mid-20s range of percentage. So maybe 23, 24%, maybe as low as 20%, but somewhere in that range. It's still, put it up near the, number 3 spot, but you cannot do that. You can't guess at that because it may be that 14%, all of them are in this 18%. So it could be this number doesn't change at all. I don't think so. I think that there's not overlap in everything, but just I want to point that out. I also want to point out that just because you've got 18% of people saying they're using it does not mean that professionally, does not mean that, it's not as good as something else. That's not how this works. I just want to point out what people are using. Notice WordPress down here, still hanging in at 12 and 12.6%. So, and then the one that makes me sad is right down here, AngularJS. If you don't know, Angular, when the Angular version 1 came out, Google brought out Angular, and they touted as this new web framework, and lots of people got on board. It was really easy to use. I was actually a company where we built a whole platform in AngularJS, and then Angular version 2 came out, and it felt like a total rewrite. It was a lot of changes, a lot of fundamental changes, not just we broke some things, but more like we changed the entire thing. And so it was like going from one framework to a different framework. And so what happened is a lot of people got stuck on Angular 1, then renamed AngularJS. So there's still 8% of people who are on AngularJS. In fact, the company I worked for at the time, they just got off of AngularJS, and I believe they upgraded to the latest Angular version. So that's kind of a little sad. There's still 8%. That is kind of a important thing to point out, is that when versions change, it can be hard if you don't provide a good path. And that's why I've been really thrilled with how ASP.NET Core does things compared to ASP.NET. .NET Framework upgrades were hard. .NET Core updates, which is now is called .NET, but for ASP versions, it's called ASP.NET Core still. But .NET Core versions, very easy to upgrade compared to .NET. That's where, if you can keep people moving forward in the latest version, that's really good because it doesn't fragment then your market. So with that, Blazor's down here at 5.4%, which is great. That's a pretty high number because of the fact that it's just a part of overall ASP.NET Core. So I am curious to see if people didn't check ASP.NET Core but did check Blazor. That'd be interesting. So I think that 5.4% is inside this 18%. And if it's not, I'd be really curious why it's not. So this does give you a good picture, though, of what the reality is compared to maybe what the hype is. And that's what I want to point out is sometimes there's hype around things that doesn't really match what people are using, they are getting paid to do. But even then, remember, this is just a subset of people. This is not the entire marketplace. Okay. Other frameworks, this is a little weird. So other frameworks, .NET, which is 5+, 27% of people. So 27% of these 50,000 are using .NET in their day-to-day. That's a quarter of them. And then 18.7% are using .NET Framework. Okay, so that's a lot of people. I'm not sure why it's in the other frameworks and libraries, but okay. But then down here, this is interesting. There's some other stuff that's actually like RabbitMQ, great stuff, 12%. And you can start to see some, Electron, 6% or 6.8%. Swift UI, 4%. Xamarin still has 3.6%. And if you come down here, .NET MAUI has 2.46%. So again, these are probably a big overlap between those two, since .NET MAUI is the successor to Xamarin. So some interesting things here. Uno gets on the list at 0.5%. Uno is a great platform for .NET users to be cross-platform, where they can deploy to desktop, mobile, or web. It's a great option. So there's some cool stuff here. You can check out and learn some new things that maybe you want to check out for your particular language in case it's not C#. Other tools, Docker, 56%, makes sense. But then NPM, if you're on the web, you're using NPM. So I'm not sure why it's even a tool on the list. But okay, same with Yarn. Homebrew and Webpack, these can be optional. So it kind of makes sense. But when you're kind of locked into NPM, almost locked in, I'm not sure if it makes sense to put on this list. But whatever. Same with NuGet. If you're using Visual Studio or C# in general, you're using NuGet. So a little weird, but there's some other stuff. Visual Studio Solution, I am not sure what this even means. Only 14.75% of people are using Visual Studio Solutions, and yet it said that over 25% of people were using .NET. So how is it you're not using an SLN file? I'm not sure what that even means. So whatever. Some of this stuff doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. Down here, Unity 3D, 5.6%. Cool stuff. We're learning more about that in the pre-order course they have going on right now. Okay. IDE, Integrated Development Environment. Professional developers. This is something I want to point out. It's super important. Number one, by a long shot, is Visual Studio Code. It is the most popular tool. In fact, 74% of all people who responded to this particular question, so that's 66,000, 74% of them use VS Code. Now, again, that's not necessarily their primary thing, but it is one of the IDEs they use. And in fact, it's actually a code editor. It's a little different than an IDE, but it's kind of becoming an IDE. It's a whole thing. Anyways, number two is Visual Studio. So even though, C# was, 7th or 8th in the list, and Java's above it, even so, Visual Studio is number two. Part of that is because it's what the market, the market is not nearly as fractured for .NET development as it is for some other things when it comes to IDEs. So pretty much if you're going to use, if you're going to develop in .NET, you're going to be using Visual Studio, or you're using Visual Studio Code, which that's becoming more and more popular because of the cross-platform ability. So that's pretty much your options for .NET, the primary options. Because down here you will see at 6.3% is Rider. So Rider does make this chart. I do want to point out that one of the things people ask me often when I talk about different options for Windows and Mac and Linux for C# development, I talk about Visual Studio and Visual Studio for Mac and VS Code. And people often ask, well, Tim, don't forget about Rider. And I don't forget about Rider. Rider is a great option for building .NET products across all three platforms. But the difference is Rider is not free and it's not provided by Microsoft. So I typically don't cover it because of the fact they've had some pretty good market saturation when it comes to other tutorial creators, content creators. And in some, I've had people come to me who feel like in order to be a .NET developer, you have to use Rider. And that's something I don't want to perpetuate because of the fact that that then puts a barrier of entry to .NET. And as you can see, 28% of people use Visual Studio versus only 6% that use Rider. That does not mean they don't use both, but a much larger group of people don't use Rider compared to, and they still do just fine in their day-to-day job. So Rider is a great tool, and it can solve some great problems that maybe it's better for you than Visual Studio. I'm not saying it's always better though, because it's a lot of times you can use Visual Studio just fine. And it is a great option. I just don't want to make you feel like you have to use it. I think that's what this chart kind of points out. So Visual Studio Code, I think, really filled a big niche that it wasn't even niche. It was just a big need in the market, which was a really good editor that could be flexible and was open source and available for free. So, a distant second is Visual Studio. And then third, interesting, Notepad++ makes the list. Number 4, that's pretty popular because, sometimes you just need a notepad. I can't believe that Vim is so high, but, whatever. If you love Vim, that's awesome. It's just not for me. Okay, so you can learn some other stuff on here, but the top ones, the biggest takeaway, I think, is learn VS Code, even if you're a C# developer. Okay, asynchronous tools. We're going to skip over this mainly. We're just going to, Jira still rules the marketplace here. Markdown files, number 3. I love Markdown files. But you can put them in GitHub in a repo, and then you can always track the changes over time. My team, we use Asana for our task tracking. That's 5%. Cool stuff. I passionately dislike wikis, not because wikis are bad, but because wikis are often built with the best of intentions and designed to have a ton of stuff in them and then forgotten about. And so they're filled with outdated or missing information and placeholders. And it's just frustrating. So if you're going to build a wiki, build it small and keep it up to date. All right. Down here, synchronous tools. Again, probably not a surprise. Maybe it is. Slack has been really noisy about, being the workplace tool, and yet Microsoft Teams beats it out. Part of that is because it comes with Microsoft Office, which is like the Office platform on the planet. So that may be why, my team uses Microsoft Teams, again, because it's there. And I'm not a big fan of Slack, actually. I'm not a huge fan of Teams either, but yeah, I think this is the lesser of two evils, at least in my perspective. So Zoom, number 3, yeah, because the pandemic really pushed that to the top. Discord down here at number 5, which is interesting because it's not really a good professional tool. Not because it's not professional, because it doesn't have the tools necessary to manage it professionally. That's probably the thing that's the hardest here with Discord. So, and then you have your other options. Interestingly, you have Google Meet at number 4. Don't depend on Google. Just don't. Because I want you to point out, Google Chat is on here as well. What's the difference? It's a different team inside of Google. It's the same type of product. And in fact, I believe there's 2 different Google Meets. They're both called Google Meet, as well as Google Chat, and they're deprecating some, and it's just an absolute mess. Google just kills products, and it's not good for anybody. So, operating system. Again, this is something that shouldn't shock people, but seems to. And that is that Windows is still very, very popular among developers. People often say, oh, you can't develop on Windows. This is half of people use Windows for their development. Half. So a third use Mac, and just over a quarter use Ubuntu. So, and the interesting thing is here, yes, Ubuntu is pretty high, but Windows subsystem for Linux, that's putting Linux on Windows. And the version of, or the flavor of Linux they push most often is Ubuntu. So, there may be more people on Windows using Linux than there used to be because of the fact they have the option very easily with Windows subsystem for Linux. I know I have Ubuntu installed on my machine and use WSL all the time for things like Docker. So just want to point that out, though, that's where we're at with the operating systems. Okay. And then AI search tools. This isn't terribly useful because of the fact that this survey was done in May of 2023. And so at that time, the 2 big AIs out there were ChatGPT, and Bing AI had just made the scene and started to give invite-only access to even Bing. So that, I assume, is going to go higher, probably, because of the fact that it's open access now, and there'll be more competition for ChatGPT. ChatGPT is the first big splashiest one, so I think these other ones are going to have more of a shot. We'll see where they end up, shaking out, and probably what we'll see next year are new ones on this list, and some of these have dropped off this list. So, AI developer tools. Again, this is something where we don't have a whole lot of choice, but GitHub Copilot is a great choice. I've been using it. I really like it. I think it's pretty impressive. Also, Tab 9 is on this list. It's a nice offline AI from what I've heard. I have not actually used it myself. I might use it at some point. We'll see. But yeah, so there's not a lot of choices here. So just take this with a grain of salt. We're going to look more at AI in just a minute. But first, let's go down to top paying technologies. This is important. Remember back at the beginning, I talked about that near the bottom of people using most popular technologies, near the bottom was Zig. You probably haven't heard of Zig. Number 1 in the list of top paying technologies. This should tell you that you should not just look at this and start chasing a language. Because, was it 0.7% of people use Zig that responded? And yet it, by far, by $5,000 or $4,000 is the highest paying language on this list. Now, if you scroll down the very bottom here, we also have number of responses. Notice that 273 people responded. That is not a large sample size. What that means is there's probably not a lot of people using Zig, but those who are pretty rare and specialized. Therefore, they are paid accordingly. Okay. So that also, I wanted to point out, Ruby is a pretty big number. You come down here, Go is a pretty big number, and then you get down to Rust is a pretty big number. Then you got Bash at 16,000. We've got, we keep scrolling here and scrolling here. There's C# with 13,000, TypeScript at 20,000, Python at 21,000, SQL at 24,000, JavaScript at 30,000. You might say, oh my goodness, we're scrolling so far down this list. Okay, so the first big one, we're talking about 5 figures, is Bash, which that's not your whole job for most people. So let's scroll down to Python. Python's the first, 10,000 plus people in this that could be a career into itself. So let's look at Python's median salary. So Python is $78,000. Come down here to C#, $74,000. Down to JavaScript, $74,000. You come down here to, even all the way down here to HTML, $70,000. The difference isn't that large. But even more, if you're, thinking this through, you might say, wait a minute, Tim, we're talking about dollars, US dollars, but only 20% of people that responded were in the United States. And that is correct. So these numbers here are for the entire world, and yet we're trying to figure out what the averages are. So that's a little hard to do, but just note everything's pretty much in the same zone. It starts to drop off a little bit with VisualBasic.net at 65,000, MATLAB at 61 again. And then PHP, that's interesting. It's only a 58.9, even though PHP, has traditionally run the web, and it's a big portion of what is on the web because of the fact that it powers WordPress and other things. So down here, again, more salary stuff, but again, it's just saying, hey, things have changed. And if you look at the changes, they're pretty much, except for SAS, but normal things, 65 to 74, okay, $9,000, 50 to 58, $8,000, 68 to 74, $6,000, TypeScript, 70 to 77, $7,000, 63 to 70, $7,000, 69 to 74 is $5,000, 69 to 74 is $5,000. We're trying $5,000 to $7,000 increases. What is that? Well, it's pretty much the cost of living for developers is what they're, on average bumping up, or the median is bumping up. So the only really thing to note in this chart is when things go the other direction. So down here, Julia, Julia developers, Erlang, Fortran, Crystal, these are all, on the decline. Okay, so we're going to come back a little bit to salary in a minute because I think that's important, but we're going to cover it down below under work because that's where we actually can break it out by country. That makes it more important. But let's just touch briefly on AI and look at sentiment and usage. Just I want to talk about the sentiment and usage of AI. Are you planning to use AI? Yes, is it 44%? No, but I plan to soon is 25.8%. I think that's the big deal. So 70% are either going to use it or are using it. I think that's the right way to go. No, and I don't plan to at 29.95%. I think you're going to miss the boat here because AI is going to help move you forward faster. And you can either gripe and complain about it and watch the rest of the world get faster as you don't, and then complain about how AI took your job. Or you can learn how to safely and correctly use AI to make yourself faster and then keep up with the rest of the development world. So I think that's something careful of there. Again, professional developers, overall sentiment, very favorable, indifferent. I think that favorable and very favorable, again, it's the highest percentage here. What is that, 77%-ish? I think that's, a good way of looking at this. If you are, unfavorable, very unfavorable, that's, it's kind of complaining about innovation. Yes, there are problems with AI. Yes, there's going to be problems with AI, but it's a reality of what we have today, and it's going to be here for a long time. Therefore, you need to figure out a way to live with it, I guess, is the best way. And you can be indifferent, or unsure for sure. But just, kind of being a little grumpy about it isn't going to help anything or solve anything. Okay, so let's jump into the last section I want to talk about, which is salaries. So this is where they actually broke it out by country. You can look through your particular country if it's on this list. And if it's not, try and find a country that best relates to where you're at. Because if you notice, all respondents, the highest is 124,000 for a senior executive C-suite. Well, if you go to Germany, senior executive doesn't even make the top of the list. It's number 2, and it's 107,000. India, senior executive is not even on this list at all, and the highest is 42,000. So which one, you are really depends on where you're coming from. Again, 124,000 is top of the list for all respondents on average, but in the United States, it's 220,000. So that's a big deal difference. So be careful trying to make decisions on this. Also note this is median yearly salary, and that includes benefits and bonuses and that kind of stuff. This does not mean that every developer gets paid this. This is just the middle person. This is, half are below this line and half are above this line. So if you look, this is where I find it kind of fascinating. Developer backend, 165,000. And then you come down here to developer front end, 140,000. And developer full stack also at 140,000. So a backend developer, in theory, makes $25,000 more than a full stack or front end. We're going to talk more about backend, full front end, and full stack developers in the next coming weeks, because I think it's important to understand what does backend, front end, and full stack even mean, because I think that part of this may be that people are misunderstanding what that title actually means. So if we look here under number of responses, so if we have backend, that's 1,900 people responded with backend developer role. Only 655 said front end, and 4,300 said full stack. So I think there's some misconceptions here what these are. Also, if you talk about popularity, people would say that front end is most popular, and front end is, everything. The front end is where you get Angular, React, and Vue, and, web dev in general is front end development. And yet people often say, well, I'm actually a full stack developer. Well, guess what? The back end development seems to pay better, and it seems to be pretty popular compared to full stack or front end. Now, yes, full stack has twice as many people, but I'm curious to know if that's actually true, or if people are confusing full stack with front end. Because if you are an Angular developer, you're a front end developer, not a full stack developer. You wouldn't be a full stack developer unless you're also writing the APIs, like using Node or something else to write the back end code, talking to a database, and all the rest. So what we're going to do over the next coming weeks, we're going to break down what is a front end developer, how to become a front end developer, and so on. We're going to cover that in dev questions, and we're going to follow that up the next Monday afterwards with talking about how to become one in C#, whatever that is, front end, back end, or full stack. And then we'll have some examples as well for a challenge, and also the solution to the challenge for how to do front end work or back end work or full stack work. So that kind of give you a better idea of what these are and what's right for you. Because you know what? You could be just fine. You can have a great career in any of these. Also, just so you know, just because you say you're a back-end developer does not mean that you get $165,000 a year. That's the median. Half of the people that are back-end developers are below that line. Also, just because the middle for back-end developer is $165,000 doesn't mean that a front-end developer might not make more than that. They might make $200,000. So just be careful, again, don't bend this to your will. Try and learn from this what you need to, and maybe learn more about, hey, what is a DevOps specialist? There's a developer, gamer graphics developer, $158,000. That really depends. I've seen a lot of people go much, much lower than that. But, okay, the other thing I want to point out is, this makes me sad, and it's not for me, but if you notice, educator, $100,000, that seems very high still, but the reality is that it's probably a lot lower than even that if we're talking about, education in high school or education for even community college. I know that at the community college I taught at, now this is back about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, something like that. It was barely break even money to teach a class. Like, we're talking for a whole semester, I'd get, I think, $3,000 for all that work. So that's kind of sad, because I think that the rest of these careers should depend more on educators, helping them get into these other roles. And as such, you need to attract people from these other roles to come back and be educators. That way you bring the experience into the education role. Unfortunately, the educator being paid the least means that you're not really attracting people that are higher on this list who have been there, done that, to come and then teach, which means that you don't get a better result out of the education system. Again, that's not me. That's not, teaching independently. That's more in line with probably college or high school education. So that's just kind of makes me a little sad. Okay. And you can also talk about this is interesting, salary and developer or experience by developer type. So notice front end down here. This is interesting because it says average years of professional experience. That's the X direction. And the Y is the average annual salary in US dollars. So front-end developer is the lower left quadrant. Why that's interesting is because it tells us that the average respondent is pretty new to the role on average. If they're between 7 and 8 years in the role, that's a lot less than, for example, a database administrator who on average is between 15 and 16 years in the role. So experience does matter. Experience is what's going to help you understand how to make wise decisions, and really is what companies are going to pay for is an experience. So front-end developer tends to be younger and also get paid a lot less, $60,000 on average. Whereas there's our back-end again, so between 10, 11 years, more experienced and getting paid more money. Now, and again, red means a lot of respondents, blue means not many. So blockchain, only 185 people responded compared to 9,500 for back end. So just kind of point that out. Educators, there you go, $65,000, even though they have between 14 and 15 years of experience. That's kind of rough. Now, only 155 responded, so that is a small sample size. But something to point out is, there's our full stack, gets paid better here, and is almost the same experience level as back-end developers. So experience does make a difference when it comes to how much you're paid. Okay, so that's kind of the big takeaways from this I want to point out. I want you to think through with your career. Hey, where am I at? What things can I pick up? What do I need to look at adding in order to become a more well-rounded developer? What new technologies I've seen in this list maybe I should look more into if I'm ready? The big takeaway, I think, especially this graph shows, is as you become more experienced in something, you usually get paid more, unless you're an educator. But that's usually what happens is, developer up here, developer advocate, developer here, developer experience, even the back-end developer. You tend to go higher in the average salary or median salary when you get more experience. So that's still something that's important, but what tools, technology should you add? Docker was really high. Visual Studio Code was really high. Knowing how to do HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in the modern way. That's something that people miss a lot. Really important. So these are things that you might want to add to your skill set, or maybe change up how you put it on your resume. So those are the things that I want to point out from this survey. Again, we're going to talk more about the front end, the back end, and the full stack developers. I think there's some clarity we can add around what those things are and how to become them, and what skills and tools you need to add to your inventory to make sure that you're well-rounded in that category and can command the best of these salaries in that category. Okay, so we'll do that in the upcoming. We have a video on Thursday talking about, I believe, front-end developer comes first. We'll talk about that and what that is and how it works as we get into more of understanding how to be a developer in today's marketplace. All right, thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.